The streets of Harlem never slept. Even at midnight, the sidewalks hummed with life. Jazz music leaked from club windows. Women in bright dresses laughed on stoops. Men in sharp suits argued over card games under yellow streetlights. The smell of fried chicken mixed with cigarette smoke drifted through the air like a slow song playing from somewhere you couldn't quite find. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson stood at the corner of 116th Street and Lenox Avenue and watched all of it. He was 12 years old. His shoes had holes in the bottom. His jacket was too small for his growing shoulders. But his eyes, those sharp, quiet eyes, missed nothing. He watched which men carried money. He watched which corners the police avoided. He watched who talked to whom, and more importantly, who never talked to anyone at all. Back in Charleston, South Carolina, where Bumpy was born in 1905, his family called him different, strange, too quiet for a child, too serious for his age. His mother used to say he came out of the womb already thinking about something that happened yesterday. His older sister brought him to Harlem to give him a better life. What she gave him instead was a front-row seat to the greatest show on earth, a neighborhood where black people had built something extraordinary despite everything America had done to stop them. Harlem in the 1920s was not just a place, it was a statement. Black doctors, black lawyers, black artists, black musicians, all living within the same few square miles, creating a culture that was shaking the world. The Harlem Renaissance was in full bloom, and even a poor boy with holes in his shoes could feel the electricity of it. But Bumpy also saw the other side. He saw the hunger. He saw the mothers who couldn't pay rent. He saw the fathers who worked 12-hour shifts and still came home with barely enough for bread. He saw a community that was brilliant and beautiful and completely broke, trapped in a system designed to keep them exactly where they were. He made a decision that night on that corner. If the system wasn't going to give his people anything, then he was going to take it. She moved through Harlem like royalty. Stephanie St. Clair did not walk, she processed. Her clothes were always immaculate. Her French accent from Martinique made every word sound like a royal command. Everywhere she went, people stepped aside, not out of fear, but out of genuine respect. They called her Madame Queen. They called her the most dangerous woman in New York City. Both names were correct. She had built her empire from absolutely nothing. Stephanie arrived in America in 1912 with almost no money and almost no English. Within a decade, she had turned Harlem's numbers game, the neighborhood's beloved illegal lottery, into a million-dollar enterprise. Every morning, poor residents placed small bets, sometimes just a nickel or a dime, on 3-digit numbers. If your number came in, you won big. The odds were steep, but the dream was worth it. Stephanie understood something most people missed. The numbers game was not just gambling, it was hope. It was the one way a black cleaning woman or a black factory worker could wake up in the morning and think, maybe today is my day. She wasn't just running a business, she was selling dreams to people who had been told their whole lives that they didn't deserve any. She ran her operation with military discipline. Bookmakers on every corner, runners who collected slips and cash, lookouts who warned her before police arrived. She paid her workers well. She was fair with her customers. And when someone tried to cross her, they discovered that Madam Queen was not a title she had chosen for herself. It was a title she had earned the hard way. One afternoon, her top man brought a young enforcer to her apartment. Bumpy Johnson sat across from Stephanie St. Clair. The apartment smelled of expensive perfume and strong coffee. He was in his early 20s, already known on the streets as someone who could handle trouble, not just with his fists, but with his mind. Stephanie studied him for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "I hear you read books." "Yes, ma'am," Bumpy said. "Which ones?" "Right now I'm reading about Toussaint Louverture, the Haitian revolutionary who defeated Napoleon's army." A slow smile crossed Stephanie's face. She had found her general. She taught him everything, how the operation worked from top to bottom, the mathematics of risk and payout, how to read a neighborhood, which blocks were loyal, which were vulnerable, which ones were being watched. But most importantly, she taught him the deepest truth about power. Power is not about being the strongest man in the room, she told him. Power is about making sure that when you walk in, everyone already knows the fight is over before it starts. Bumpy absorbed everything like dry ground absorbs rain. Within 2 years, he had become her top lieutenant, her enforcer, and in many ways her true partner. He protected her bookmakers. He resolved disputes. He handled threats with a combination of intelligence and controlled force that kept Harlem's numbers operation running like a perfect machine. Harlem belonged to them both. Then, Dutch Schultz arrived, and everything changed. Arthur Flegenheimer was a name that nobody feared, which is why he changed it. Dutch Schultz was a name that made people go pale. He was a white Jewish gangster from the Bronx who had built his fortune through bootlegging during Prohibition. When Prohibition ended in 1933 and that income dried up, Dutch Schultz looked around for his next opportunity. He looked at Harlem and saw gold. The numbers game was pulling in somewhere between $20 and $40 million a year across New York's black neighborhoods. Schultz wanted all of it, not a partnership, not a negotiation. He wanted to walk in, take over, and force every independent numbers banker in Harlem to either pay him tribute or face his men. His approach was simple and brutal. He sent messengers to Harlem's bankers one by one with a single offer. Give Dutch Schultz a percentage of everything you earn, and you live. Refuse, and his men would come back with guns instead of words. Most small bankers folded immediately. They were not equipped to fight a man like Schultz, who had dozens of armed men, corrupt police officers in his pocket, and complete willingness to murder anyone who stood in his path. When his messenger arrived at Stephanie St. Clair's door, she sent the man back with a single sentence. Tell Mr. Schultz that Harlem is not his to take. Dutch Schultz laughed when he heard it. He stopped laughing soon enough. Bumpy Johnson had spent years reading about great strategists. Toussaint Louverture, who defeated Napoleon not with superior numbers or weapons, but with superior intelligence. Frederick Douglass, who turned words into weapons more powerful than any gun. What all of them had in common was this: they never fought the enemy's war. They fought their own. Dutch Schultz expected a frontal attack. He had more men, more weapons, and more money. A straight fight, and Schultz would win easily. So Bumpy refused to fight that war. Instead, he built something that Dutch Schultz had no idea how to defeat. An intelligence network made entirely of ordinary people. Children played on every street corner. Old women sat on every stoop. Shop owners stood in every doorway. None of them looked like operatives. All of them were. When Schultz's men entered a block, word traveled ahead of them faster than they could walk. By the time they arrived at any destination, the bookmaker they were looking for had already moved. The money they came to collect had already disappeared. The person they came to threaten was already gone. It was maddening. It was humiliating. And Schultz had absolutely no answer for it. Bumpy also attacked Schultz's operation indirectly. The numbers game depended entirely on trust between the banker and the community. When word spread through Harlem that Dutch Schultz was a dangerous outside predator who had muscled his way into their neighborhood against the will of their own people, those bookmakers started losing customers fast. Nobody wanted to hand their nickel to a man who worked for the wolf. Bumpy made sure that word spread quickly and thoroughly. There were also moments of direct, targeted response. When Schultz sent men to hurt bookmakers who refused to cooperate, Bumpy's answer was precise and immediate. He did not respond randomly. Every act of aggression against Harlem was answered with specific consequences that sent a message even the densest enforcer could understand. This neighborhood fights back, every time, without exception. Months passed. Schultz was losing money on the operation. His men were increasingly nervous, working in a neighborhood where someone seemed to know everything before it happened, and his bosses were asking uncomfortable questions about why Harlem was taking so long. He escalated the violence. Bumpy escalated the resistance. The war ground on. It cost both sides. Bumpy lost men he cared about. He was arrested multiple times on minor charges. harassment designed to disrupt his operation while he sat in a cell. Some bookmakers begged him to make a deal. Others quietly moved away, unable to endure the constant pressure. But Bumpy held his line. He held it because he understood something essential. The moment you show a predator weakness, the pressure doubles. The only way to handle Dutch Schultz was to make the cost of attacking Harlem permanently higher than any possible profit. As long as Schultz was bleeding money and credibility in the neighborhood, the fight was winnable. Stephanie St. Clair was unwavering throughout. The ones who survive, she told him, are not the strongest or the fastest. They are the ones who refuse to stop. So Bumpy refused to stop. Then on October 23, 1935, everything changed in a restaurant in Newark, New Jersey. Dutch Schultz sat down for dinner at the Palace Chop House in Newark. He never got up again. Members of Murder, Inc., the enforcement arm of the national organized crime syndicate known as the Commission, walked into that restaurant and shot Dutch Schultz and 3 of his associates. The hit had not been ordered by Bumpy Johnson. It had been ordered by the Commission itself, by Lucky Luciano and the bosses of the 5 families, who had grown tired of Schultz's unpredictable behavior. Schultz had been planning to assassinate Special Prosecutor Thomas Dewey, and the Commission believed that killing a federal prosecutor would bring catastrophic heat down on all of organized crime in America. They decided Schultz himself was the bigger problem and voted accordingly. Dutch Schultz died in a Newark hospital 2 days later, delirious and muttering nonsense about angels and money. When news reached Harlem, the streets erupted. People celebrated openly. The man who had terrorized their community, who had tried to steal the economic lifeline that their own people had built, was dead. There was dancing. There was music. Old women on their stoops said, "The Lord sees everything." Men who had never much liked Bumpy Johnson found themselves shaking his hand. Bumpy did not celebrate. He was already thinking about what came next. Because Dutch Schultz being dead did not mean Harlem was free. The men who had ordered Schultz's killing, Lucky Luciano and the 5 families, were now the undisputed rulers of organized crime in New York City. They were more sophisticated than Schultz, more patient, and considerably more dangerous, and they had their own plans for Harlem's millions. Bumpy had survived the wolf. Now he had to deal with the lions. To sit across from Lucky Luciano was to sit across from the most calculating criminal mind in American history. Charles Lucky Luciano had accomplished what everyone said was impossible. He had unified the warring Italian-American crime families into a single structured organization, the Commission, that ran more like a Fortune 500 company than a street gang. He thought in years. He planned in decades, and he had an almost supernatural ability to see exactly what someone wanted and use that knowledge to control them completely. When Bumpy Johnson walked in to negotiate, Luciano already knew everything about him. Bumpy knew that too. So he came prepared. He laid out his case with calm, quiet precision. Harlem was a specific neighborhood with specific people and specific loyalties that no outside force had ever successfully controlled long term. He understood those dynamics. His people understood them. Any attempt by the Italian families to take over directly would face the same resistance that Dutch Schultz had faced, except now it would be far better organized, because they had spent years fighting and learning and improving. But Bumpy was not simply there to issue threats. He was there to make a deal that worked for everyone. His proposal was this: the Italian Mafia would receive a percentage of Harlem's numbers profits in exchange for protection and access to their supply chains, primarily their narcotics connections. Bumpy would retain full operational control of Harlem. He would guarantee the payments every time without fail. He would handle all local disputes and all local enforcement. Everyone would make money. Nobody would have to die. Luciano looked at Bumpy Johnson across that table for a long moment. Then he nodded. The deal was sealed. In that moment, Bumpy Johnson became the first black gangster in American history to negotiate a genuine equal partnership with the 5 families of the Italian Mafia. He had turned the violent chaos of the numbers war into leverage, and used that leverage to secure a position that no one before him had ever achieved. But deals made at that table always carried hidden costs, costs that weren't written down anywhere and didn't reveal themselves until it was too late to walk them back. After the deal with Luciano, Bumpy Johnson's name carried a different kind of weight. He was no longer just Stephanie St. Clair's enforcer. He was no longer simply the man who had survived the numbers war. He was something that Harlem had never quite had before, a figure of genuine, undisputed authority who operated as a protector of the community rather than just a predator within it. This distinction mattered far more than people outside Harlem understood. In most American cities, organized crime simply preyed on neighborhoods. It took money out and put nothing back except fear. Bumpy's operation worked differently. When a Harlem landlord tried to illegally throw a family out on the street, Bumpy's name was sometimes enough to make that landlord reconsider very quickly. When a predatory lender was trapping residents in impossible debt, word sometimes got back to Bumpy, and that lender sometimes found his business suddenly unwelcome in the neighborhood. Bumpy employed people. He supported local businesses. He sent turkeys to poor families at Thanksgiving and Christmas. He paid school fees for children whose parents had nothing. He was generous in ways that the government and legitimate businesses in Harlem consistently refused to be. He also read everything he could get his hands on. He could sit down with scholars and discuss philosophy, history, and literature with the ease of a man who had spent his whole life inside books. He wrote poetry. He was simultaneously one of the most physically dangerous men in New York City and one of the most genuinely thoughtful. People in Harlem called him the King. He walked through the neighborhood with the easy confidence of a man who understood that every person he passed either respected him or feared him, and that in his world, both amounted to exactly the same thing. He had risen from a poor boy with holes in his shoes to the ruler of the most famous black neighborhood in America. But the deal with Luciano had already set something terrible in motion, something that was slowly poisoning the community. Bumpy had spent his entire life trying to protect. Heroin arrived in Harlem like a slow flood. At first it was barely noticeable. A few young men on certain corners, whispered conversations, small transactions that looked like nothing from a distance. But by the late 1940s, the flood was impossible to ignore. The Italian family's supply chains, the very ones that Bumpy's deal with Luciano had helped open, were pumping massive quantities of heroin directly into the neighborhood that Bumpy had spent his career protecting. And Bumpy was, whether he fully accepted it or not, part of the machine that made it possible. This is the part of Bumpy Johnson's story that cannot be smoothed over or made comfortable. The man who had risked everything to fight Dutch Schultz and protect Harlem had now opened the neighborhood's back door to something far more destructive than Schultz had ever been. Heroin did not rob a community at gunpoint. It did it slowly, intimately, one young person at a time, stealing futures instead of wallets, hollowing out families from the inside instead of threatening them from the street. Bumpy saw it happening. He could not avoid it. He watched young men he had known as children become empty shells on street corners. He watched mothers weep over sons who had disappeared into addiction. He watched a community that had survived slavery, Jim Crow, and the Great Depression begin to buckle under something that no external enemy had ever managed to deliver. Whether Bumpy felt genuine guilt about his role in this is something historians still debate. What is clear is that in his later years, he spoke with deep bitterness about the narcotics trade and the destruction it had brought to Harlem. What is also clear is that in 1952, the consequences of that trade came for him personally, not in the form of a rival's bullet, but in the form of federal agents with badges and warrants, and a case they had been building quietly for 18 months. The federal government had been watching Bumpy Johnson for years. He was too careful, too intelligent, and too well insulated for local police to build anything that would stick. Cases fell apart, evidence disappeared, witnesses couldn't remember crucial details. He had survived more close calls than any man in his position had a right to survive. But the federal government played a much longer game than local police. By 1950, a dedicated team of federal narcotics agents had been quietly constructing a case against Bumpy's operation for a year and a half. They were patient in a way that local detectives were not. They turned informants slowly and carefully. They documented transactions across many months. They built something designed specifically not to fall apart in a courtroom. Bumpy knew they were watching him. He changed his routines constantly. He communicated through layers of trusted intermediaries. He stayed away from direct involvement in drug transactions, relying on lieutenants to insulate him from the physical reality of what his organization was doing. He was so careful that for a long time, the federal case looked like it was going nowhere. Then someone he trusted said the wrong thing to the wrong person. Exactly who betrayed Bumpy Johnson in 1952 is something that was never definitively proven. Names have been whispered for decades. Accusations have been made and disputed. What is certain is that in February of 1952, federal agents moved on his operation with a precision that could only have come from very specific, very intimate information. They arrested him on conspiracy charges related to heroin sales. In the courtroom, his lawyers were aggressive and skilled. They challenged every witness, questioned every piece of evidence, and made the powerful argument that Bumpy was a convenient target, a black man with a criminal reputation being used as a scapegoat, while the Italian families actually responsible for flooding Harlem with heroin walked free without a single charge. They pointed out that convicting Bumpy would not stop a single gram of heroin from coming into the neighborhood, because the people bringing it into the country were sitting untouched in their social clubs in Brooklyn and Manhattan. It was a powerful argument. The jury was not particularly interested in it. The verdict came down on a hot summer afternoon. 15 years. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary. Bumpy Johnson stood up slowly from the defense table and looked at the jury for a long, quiet moment. No one in that courtroom could read his face. Then he straightened his jacket, nodded once to his lawyers, and walked out between two federal marshals. The King of Harlem was going to the Rock. The island rose out of San Francisco Bay like a nightmare carved from stone. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary was built specifically to break the men sent there. It housed America's most dangerous criminals, men who had escaped from other prisons, men who had proved impossible to control anywhere else. The cells were cold and small. The rules were absolute. The sound of bay water slapping against the island's rocks was a constant, cruel reminder that freedom existed just across the water and was completely unreachable. Bumpy Johnson walked into Alcatraz with the same composed face he had worn in the courtroom. He was in his mid-50s. He had survived Dutch Schultz. He had survived previous prison sentences. He was not going to let a stone island destroy what decades of warfare hadn't touched. He went back to his books. He wrote poetry. He caused no problems for the guards and gave them no reason to single him out. He was a model prisoner in the sense that his compliance was a visible, deliberate choice, not a surrender. But behind that calm face, something was burning steadily. He thought about what had been done to him. He thought about the people who had profited from his work while he sat in a cage. He thought about Harlem, what the heroin was doing to it, who was getting rich while the community crumbled, who was walking free while he served their sentence for them. Outside the walls, the world moved without him. Harlem changed. The neighborhood that had been the cultural capital of Black America began to fracture under the combined weight of poverty, neglect, and the narcotics epidemic that had taken root in the years before his arrest. The Italian families extracted their profits and invested nothing back. The protection that Bumpy's presence had provided was gone entirely. The 1950s became the 1960s, and the civil rights movement swept across America like a fire that had been waiting for wind. Harlem became one of its centers. Malcolm X stood on 125th Street and spoke to thousands about dignity, self-determination, and the right to defend yourself against a system designed to destroy you. His words were electric and impossible to ignore. Bumpy followed all of it from his cell. He had known Malcolm X personally. Both men, in their radically different ways, were trying to protect the same people from the same system. Malcolm was building revolution through language and faith. Bumpy had tried to build it through power and money. The tools were different. The love for Harlem was identical. When Bumpy was finally released in the mid-1960s, he returned to a Harlem that was not the one he had left. It was harder, sadder, and more wounded, but it was still standing, and so was he. He stepped off the plane in New York City on a cold morning and stood for a moment breathing air that was not the air of a prison island. Then he took a cab to Harlem, because that was the only place that had ever been home. The neighborhood received him with a mixture of relief and reverence. To many people, his return meant something beyond the personal. It meant that the system, with all of its enormous power, had tried to destroy this specific man and had failed. He walked back into the streets as living proof that survival was possible. He reconnected with his wife, Mame, a woman of extraordinary patience and grace who had endured his absences and imprisonments and his lifelong habit of choosing Harlem over everything else. If Bumpy Johnson had a moral anchor in his life, it was Mamie. He walked through the neighborhood and saw in full daylight what the heroine had accomplished. Young men who should have been in school were on corners in the slow haze of addiction. Businesses that had once been thriving were shuttered. Families that had once been solid were broken by the specific, devastating grief of watching someone you loved disappear into drugs. Bumpy saw all of it. And he was furious, not just at the Italian families or at the federal government, but at himself, for the role his decisions had played in opening this door. He could not close it now, but he could do something. When Malcolm X was navigating the most dangerous period of his life, having broken publicly with the Nation of Islam and facing threats from multiple directions, stories spread through Harlem that Bumpy Johnson had made himself available in a very specific way. The exact nature of the protection he offered is debated by historians. But the core of the story, supported by multiple witnesses across many years, is consistent. Bumpy used whatever influence and capability he had left to create a protective buffer around Malcolm X during the months when Malcolm's enemies were closing in. Why? Because Malcolm X was doing openly and legally what Bumpy had always tried to do through underground channels, demanding that the people of Harlem be treated with dignity, telling the truth about a system designed to crush them, and refusing to apologize for any of it. Bumpy could not undo his past. He could not reverse the damage the narcotics trade had done. But he could stand between a man fighting for his people and the people trying to silence that fight forever. He did it without fanfare, without any expectation of credit, without a single press conference. It was the act of a man trying to settle a debt he knew could never be fully repaid. By 1968, Bumpy Johnson was a man in his 60s who had spent decades moving at the speed of survival, and his body had finally begun to show the accumulated cost of it. He moved more slowly, he tired more easily, but he refused to become invisible. He refused to slip quietly into old age like someone who had run out of things to say. He still walked through Harlem, he still sat in the restaurants where he had always sat. He still talked about books, about history, about Harlem's extraordinary potential, about what the community could still become if its young people chose knowledge and strategy over impulsive anger. He was still thinking, still reading, still caring, still furious on behalf of the people he had spent his life trying to protect. On July 7, 1968, Bumpy Johnson was having dinner at Wells Restaurant on 7th Avenue in Harlem. He was in the middle of a conversation, talking about the neighborhood, about young black men, about the importance of building something that could last beyond one man's lifetime. He stopped speaking in the middle of a sentence. A heart attack. Right there at the table, in the restaurant, in the neighborhood he had bled for and been imprisoned for and loved more than he had ever loved anything else. He was pronounced dead at the hospital shortly afterward. Ellsworth Raymond Bumpy Johnson was 62 years old. Harlem grieved in the streets. Hundreds of people came to his funeral, not just the underworld figures you might expect, but ordinary residents, families whose rent he had paid, children he had sent to school, people whose landlords he had convinced to be reasonable, women who had received turkeys at Christmas from a man who expected nothing in return. They came because he had been real to them in ways that politicians and institutions had rarely managed to be. The newspapers wrote about him as a gangster, and that was accurate as far as it went. But it did not go very far at all. Bumpy Johnson was a man produced by a specific time and place and a very specific set of conditions. A black man in early 20th century America with two choices: accept the poverty and limitation that the system had designed for him, or refuse. He refused. The tools available to a man of his background in his era for that kind of refusal were the ones he used. They were imperfect tools that caused real damage, including damage to the community he loved. The heroin trade that his deal with Luciano had helped enable destroyed more lives than Dutch Schultz had ever touched. That truth lives alongside every other truth about Bumpy Johnson and cannot be separated from it. He was both things simultaneously: the protector and the one who left the back door open, the man who fought for Harlem and the man whose deals helped hollow it out. He was not a hero in a clean story. He was a human being in a complicated one, which is the only kind of story that real history ever produces. Here's what revenge looked like for Bumpy Johnson. It did not look like a single dramatic moment. It did not look like Dutch Schultz begging for mercy or federal prosecutors admitting they were wrong. It did not look like the villain falling to his knees while the hero stands triumphant in the light. Real revenge is slower and stranger than the kind you see in movies. Revenge was Bumpy Johnson, a poor boy from Charleston who arrived in Harlem with holes in his shoes and no particular reason to believe his life would amount to anything. Sitting across from Lucky Luciano as an equal, negotiating a deal that the most powerful criminal organization in America had no choice but to respect and honor.